Hello, and welcome to Vision New England's Church in Action podcast. Here we talk with New England leaders about critical issues that impact how Christians engage in our culture to accelerate evangelism.
Hi, and welcome to our conversation today about the Declaration of Independence. I'd like to welcome our first guest is the Reverend Dr. Michael Bailey. He's the co-pastor of the First Cathedral in the greater Hartford area of Connecticut and the director of Vision New England. And our second guest, not in order of priority at all, guys, I promise, Professor Timothy Sherratt, who teaches American politics and constitutional law and public policy at Gordon College. And I'm Charles Galda. I'm blessed to lead Vision New England. Guys, thanks so much for being with us and giving us your time today. So let me just jump into the topic of the Declaration of Independence, because a fair question is, what on earth does that have to do with evangelism? And it's not immediately obvious, so bear with us. We are in a country, as I think everybody knows, that is divided over almost everything, it seems these days, but specifically around ethnicity and race. And the church is called to be a peacemaker, even in that kind of a circumstance where we're so polarized. And we can't be a peacemaker if we don't understand the context and if we don't understand each other's perspectives, so that we could identify real solutions that we could take action of as the church in unity. And so our goal is to have a dialogue today about the genius of the Declaration of Independence and some of the challenges of it. And you may find that you don't agree when we are having our conversation. You may find we don't agree when we're having our conversation, because our goal is not to get three people on here who agree about everything. It's to have an exchange of perspectives to understand each other so that we might be able to have solutions that could be evangelistic in its intent. I keep thinking about, imagine if the church had no racial divides in it. What a witness that could be to the world, and how we would have something really important to say to the world around race. And I go back to Matthew 5:16 often, where Jesus is saying, let your light shine before men in a way such that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. If we had solved this problem in the church and we could talk to the world about it, people would praise God in heaven. And the church would have a voice in it that we don't have today. So that's the connection and why we think it's so important. And so we're going to start with a little bit of history, I guess, about, and Tim, I'd like to start with you on this, but Michael, feel free to jump in. But give us a history lesson. Why was the Declaration of Independence even written? Why wasn't it just an announcement one day of we're independent or something else?
Well, I mean, the Declaration of Independence was so important because it encouraged the colonists to unite on a moral basis. If you think about the structure of it, the Declaration of Independence takes this long, you call it a laundry list of serious complaints against the British government, and it turns it into a sort of litany of crimes against humanity. And in some ways, George III isn't really the audience. It's the other colonists who are encouraged to think that their cause is just and right. So, I mean, that's why it was written, to give them that strong moral foundation for pursuing the revolution.
Was there a need for us to say it because of other powers? Were there other countries who, if we didn't announce that as formally as that and have it approved by a body, that they wouldn't have dealt with us as a separate country, or is that not really
Well, I think that's certainly the writers of the Declaration of Independence were very eager to ensure that everybody heard what it was that these American colonists were doing. I mean, they were doing something fairly amazing, right? Putting the relationship between citizens and governing authority on a completely new footing, where consent of those governed was the foundation for government. And that was a very significant step to take. And in that sense, of course, making this public was saying, we're going to do this. As I say, I think it's more to encourage the colonists that their cause is just and right.
they do, it is in the preamble, right, to articulate before men why we're doing what we're doing. It's a necessity. And so put your law professor hat on for us too, please. So not just historian, but why is the Declaration still relevant, or is it just an archived document that was relevant until the Constitution came along, for example?
Well, it's still certainly relevant, but the Declaration of Independence is not law. It doesn't decide any cases in the way that the Constitution is obviously consulted and interpreted by the Supreme Court when cases come before it. But it has that purpose, I think, still of historical foundation, inspiration for, again, as I said, this very distinct new way in which the relationship between citizens and government was being thought about.
And so it informs the Constitution then? Is that a fair way to think about it?
I think it does inform the Constitution, or it might be even better to say that the Constitution is an outworking of some of the core ideas in the Declaration, especially the Bill of Rights, of course.
So and if I go into preacher terms, then Michael, it's a commentary on the Constitution is a commentary on the Declaration. Is that fair?
That's fair enough.
Well, so now I opened by saying there's a genius to the Declaration of Independence. And so, Michael, would you agree with that? And what in it would you put in that bucket of genius if you do?
I would say it's genius by way of a document that is putting out there a notation of like a form of independence. Like I would think that is genius as far as really becoming independent from the British colonies. However, which I'm sure we'll discuss a bit further. When you look at the document, it talks about men, and we have to take into consideration who were considered the men. And we have to take in consideration the historical elements itself as far as what was going on during that time. Particularly, we can argue that slavery was something that was very big and high profile during that time. And so we have to take that into consideration. I was thinking about when you were talking about the Constitution, at one point, blacks particularly were considered 3/5 of a person. So when it talks about all men are created equal, if you're not fifth or the whole human being in their eyes, or in the particular eyes of those who wrote or who had written the document, then you must understand that that document did not apply to them. So I would say, again, the genius lies in the fact that it was a document creating independence. However, it still had its parts that wasn't fair for all people, all walks of life.
And so you're jumping ahead to a future episode on the 3/5 point, because we do want to talk about that when we get to the Constitution. So but it's a really important point. And so what I hear you saying is in the statement of all men created equal, right? That statement excluded obviously slaves.
Right.
It excluded non-property holders, right, who didn't have the vote. Excluded women. So it was a statement. And so Tim, help us a little bit on this. So is it that we did not consider those people to be somebody we would sweep into the statement of all men are created equal? Or would some be thinking about it and saying, well, no, they are, but they're just not being treated that way, or someplace in between?
Well, I think, for me, the most helpful place to go is straight to Thomas Jefferson, given his, significant authorship. The revealing document, perhaps, for his outlook is his Notes on Virginia, which is this natural history of Virginia, all about the plants and the animals and the distinct subspecies of human beings. And whether it's African American slaves or Native Americans, it's clear that although Jefferson has made this universal announcement in the Declaration that you just described, that all men are created equal, it's clear that he doesn't really honor the universal nature of the Declaration. And what he doesn't do, I think it's fairly clear, certainly from what I've read, that this is a widespread view, and that it's not that controversial for this generation of colonists to think in this way about human beings. So you might say the Declaration, or Jefferson himself, there's something deeply hypocritical about it, even though the thing that he's declared about universal liberties and equality for human beings is going to work. It takes a very, very long time, but it's clearly at work in our culture, certainly in our Constitution, to put pressure on governing authorities and courts and others to take it seriously and actually begin to apply it. But that takes such a long time, and it's hardly something that's complete now.
Because we'll get to the point. Oops, sorry, Michael, go ahead.
No, I was going to add, too, you have those who were not from the South or living in the North who were quiet about it. I would call it, and for the sake of this, forgive me for saying it this way, but it's like the good old boys club. What doesn't affect me, I'm not going to be bothered with. But, if it does affect you, then we'll have the appropriate conversation to see where we can fix whatever's bothersome to that particular group. And I think there were a number of people who signed this document from the northern states, particularly in the New England area. John Adams, for instance. We know how he felt, but he was quiet about it. He didn't want to be the one that's upsetting everyone. You know what I mean? So it's just like to upset a Thomas Jefferson is a big deal. So whatever is good for Virginia may not be good for Mass, and we're not going to talk about, well, what are we really saying? And so, even if you think about this also leads to another point that I like to bring up, and I talk about quite extensively, but not for today because it's not what we're talking about. But if you look at the history of this country, and even our nation's capital, right, Washington District of Columbia, that place was built by slaves. It was built on the back of Black Americans. And again, it goes back to what I said earlier. It goes back to how people view in certain with certain lenses others. And I think this is something that even repeats itself to today. And it's all a matter, if I can say it this way and boil it down for a second, of learned behavior. That really what was the issue there. That was a behavior that was learned. And I would even take it another level and say that was learned in Great Britain, right? And so there were certain similar things that were brought from Great Britain over here and all over the world. It was a global problem.
So we're jumping into challenges. Let me finish up on the genius first.
Sorry.
I want to come. No, that's okay. That's okay. I just want to make sure we don't miss it.
Can I say one more thing, Charles?
Please.
That takes away from the genius of the document. That takes away from the brilliance of the document.
Yeah.
And I think we can say this, that, or the other is genius because we have the Declaration of Independence, but in reality, that's what makes it doesn't look like a genius document. It doesn't look like it's going to build up or create some type of empire. Maybe an empire for certain people, but if we're talking about, again, if we're looking at all men, right? All men are created equal. Well, what is the definition? And we have to stop playing that, hey, you're less patriotic because you're not following. No, it has nothing to do with patriotism. Because if you understand what true definitions are, to me, it can be taken, and I'm thankful for it, but it also can be taken as a document of deceit.
Right. And so I want to come to that because I want to talk about how some folks have seen it too, and I want to probe on that. So I think it's a really good point. But before we get there, let me just ask a couple of questions because this one is always interested me on this. Were there abolitionists at the time, right? And specifically in the room who are voting on the Declaration of Independence? And what would have happened if they insisted on, no, we're going to deal with the slavery issue now? Were there, Tim, and I don't mean to put you on the spot with that because we didn't prep for that or anything, but were there abolitionists at this point in the founding?
I think there were abolitionists, but I think what we just heard, they like John Adams, they tend to be quiet.
Yeah.
There's a political issue that's front and center, right, for the colonists. They don't necessarily have a natural unity, except for having a common enemy in the British government. And so the big emphasis is, and that's partly what the Declaration seeks to achieve. We have a moral cause, which is to break from Great Britain because the British government has essentially committed crimes against humanity. That's how the natural rights thinking that inspires Jefferson, that's how he presents the case. But so you can say without any doubt that the slavery issue just isn't the priority. And those who hold those views, and I don't think I can't speak authoritatively on the views of who was there, who may have held them, and to what extent they held them, but this wasn't an issue that was going to derail the Declaration of Independence.
It seems to me, and this might be provocative, but it seems to me, had John Adams, for example, been vocal and insisted that we're not signing this unless we outlaw slavery, there's no founding, and it doesn't change slavery.
And it doesn't change slavery, and we might be living in several different nations, perhaps one here in New England, and I mean, that's obviously speculation, but the idea of there being a United States, that seems a bit far-fetched. If I suspect if there had been that kind of insistence on tackling the slavery question.
And I want to be careful. I don't want to excuse it for a minute because it's an evil, but it seems to me it's not a simple decision he has, the folks like him have to make. Is that fair, Michael, or would you disagree?
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. I mean, you look at it from a political undertone, right? You're separating everything. You're being the rebel, but also if you let's think about the psyche of this man, right? Just imagine you decided to speak out what you're against, right? And you're the only one. I can't, and I'm speculating as well, I can only imagine that his life would have been threatened.
Mm.
He probably would have been a dead man walking as a result of what he believed. So it's best for him, and probably in his mind, well, in my home, we'll play pretend. We'll have a pretend scenario, like, maybe if somebody came here, then I'll pretend you're slaves, but in all actuality, you just live on the property and you're free. But when it comes down to displaying it publicly to everyone, then it's problematic because it's really essentially risking losing everything. And he doesn't want to lose everything because he does have a political clout. Yeah. And I think that even speaks, and I won't go further because I know, Charles, you're going to stop me, but that even speaks to history repeating itself today. We are letting a political agenda dictate how we deal with one another. There is no care as far as what we think about one another. Instead, it's you're one party or the other, and we're not getting along.
Yeah, I was talking to a preacher last week, and he was saying that it's okay for church people to be political. We shouldn't be partisan.
Right.
Because we ought to be able to say when one party's doing stuff good and when they're doing it bad, and vice versa. And sometimes we get caught up in that ourselves in the church, where we're Republican Christians and Democrat Christians, as opposed to Christians who are Republicans or Democrats, right?
But I also think too, Charles, we have to stop questioning people's patriotism because we're not following suit with the rest of the community. That's not right. Yeah.
That's a good point. It's a good point. And so let me hit on a couple other things and tell me if these have precedence. And maybe I'll just tick off some things. So we talked about all men are created equal. They're endowed by their creator with rights, like life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. The role of government is to secure our rights. It's the right and obligation of people, and I thought obligation was a good word, to abolish the government when it's despotic, right? These are all things out of the Declaration. But prudence dictates that should not be done lightly, because you can make it worse. And so are those novel concepts at the time, or are those an evolution out of English common law or tradition or something else?
Well, I think they're definitely novel, in that the idea that there's a fundamental right of revolution, and that the ones who decide what that right is are individuals. This is why it's a very good thing the Declaration, to be quite frank, is not a governing document. It would be self-destructive, because I think at many points in American history, not just the Civil War, you'd have significant numbers of Americans deciding that they had been sufficiently offended to invoke the right to revolution. So no, this is not, these are novel ideas, and they sort of follow more, I would say they are, in a sense, the theory of Enlightenment, natural rights, and social contract. And I would say to some extent, there's certainly would be danger in them for trying to imagine a society genuinely founded on ideas like that. That's not a foundation for society.
And so, which is why we then have the Articles of Confederation and then eventually the Constitution.
Right.
And so, are there, as believers, are there things in it that we can celebrate?
Well, can I jump in?
Yeah.
I think God, just in his basis form, God. However, I cannot say we can enjoy and celebrating a bunch of things, because again, it's a novel document. And this document, its intention probably was a bit wicked at the time. Again, like I said earlier, and I'm sure I may differ in opinion from Dr. Sherratt, and you, Charles, for that matter. But at the end of the day, it wasn't fair for all people. And we have to just look at that. And we also have to, something that dawned on me earlier that we talked about, how people were viewed, right? Meaning that, hey, one group of people may have been more prestigious than another group of people, right? And I mean, women probably were celebrated more than blacks, right? Or black men. So even though it had its different areas of, I don't know, disrespect or different areas as far as like not acknowledging people as people, it still, you still had a problem as far as what the tier or the order was, and where people fell. So you got to understand, it's all bad, but I think it's also a revelation of original sin. That's what I think. It's a revelation of our sinful nature and how we will use things that have great intention but poor execution, and how we will use certain documents, which I think, and I credit Dr. Sherratt because he's a professor at Gordon College and he's much brighter than me in this area. He's a historian, but I think we can agree that when you look at these historical documents, they were more about power. They were more about selfish interests, not the common interests of the community. So like even when you look at the independence from England, I wonder, I can't help but to speculate, I'm just speculating, but I can't help but to speculate what these people were thinking about. Maybe it was something against, again, other people who were involved in this. Maybe it wanted to change his thinking, but it was more of a selfish interest. And I wonder sometimes, and I'm thankful that we have the United States of America. So those who are watching, don't think I don't love this country. But the reality is who these people were and their wicked nature could have been one that influenced things like this. And they were written just like a paper to sound all wonderful and easygoing for everybody, but in reality, it was not for everyone.
And
may I respond to your
Go
question?
ahead.
Is there something believers can celebrate? Because I think yes, the answer is yes. I mean, as I've been saying, the Declaration of Independence itself is not law. So really, the larger conversation emerges when we tackle the Constitution, perhaps. But I was listening to the hearings for the Supreme Court nomination earlier today, and Senator Sass was saying the great thing about the United States is that freedom, I'd say self-government, is the default for us. Well, I think that's part of what's very significant about the Declaration of Independence, but I want to emphasize also that its liberty emphasis meant that when the Constitution was finally written, having experimented with one form of government and moved on to the Constitution, the emphasis on liberty meant that we became a country that didn't have an established church, but had instead religious liberty. And religious liberty is extraordinarily important. It's meant that religions of all kinds have flowered here in the United States, and that is certainly something that we can celebrate coming out of the Declaration of Independence, even though there are a number of things that are much more troubling about. Certainly, I agree very much that all of these things are made by fallen human beings, and that doesn't mean we can draw a simple conclusion from them. But yes, self-interest is present, the political circumstances are present. And I should say, by the way, just true confessions, I don't have a thing against the Declaration of Independence just because I happen to be a British citizen, but I felt I should mention that.
I probably should have picked up on that mention to folks. We're asking you to defend this horrible document, right?
Well, I don't think you have anything against the Declaration of Independence. Like I said, it also could be a prophetic document, right? There could be a prophetical element that pretty much shows what society should look like. And now in 2020, we can use what was written way back when and put it in the proper place, which is something we could do now by way of law, right? Or by way of other aspects of this government. So I would say, there are beautiful things about it, but it's just, for me, when it comes down to being a realist about the document, it's not for all people, or it needs to be evolved, or not necessarily changing what's written, but I mean as far as the behaviors, the tendencies to change. And it could be a document that's used to really change how we govern our society. So I am thankful for the liberty, religious liberty. It helps us even in our area of apologetics, right? Defending the gospel, right? Mm-hmm. Help us to deal with one another. So that's that. But it's still a document, I think, from back then, that it wasn't fair for all people.
And I think well, and I want to come back to a point, Michael, you made, because I kind of glossed over it and I realized the significance of it as we went on, is, and I know you well, so to your point of you love this country, I know that, right? I know you pretty well, right?
Absolutely.
But so when you say you love this country, you and I have had enough conversations that I know that.
Right.
But that doesn't mean either one of us, and Tim, I think I'd lump you into this, even though we don't know each other as well. None of us think the country's perfect.
Right.
Right. And because it was, I think there's genius that we'll get to in the Constitution eventually, but there's where we recognize that we're building a system that is designed to check man's desire to gain power for himself and oppress other people. And so it's kind of built into the Constitution. And so because the country is founded by, I think, a lot of brilliant men, a lot of flawed men, and they were not perfect.
Right.
And if they were not perfect, their creation can't be perfect. Right. And so there's flaws in it. And so how did Martin Luther King use it? Because I think we talked about the genius of the document a little bit, although we admit that there's some issues with it. Martin Luther King, I think, was genius in how he used it. How did he use it?
Well, I think Dr. King used it in a way that it would be a prophetic work. Like, it would be a prophetic work. So what I mean by that is what I stated earlier. It may not fit the time that it was written, right? And it may have had its challenges during that time. But now, because it was written the way it was written, now we can use it as far as for a positive influence rather than a negative influence. Like now, as you talk about, all men are created equal. If you recall, historically, I wasn't alive, but I feel like I've read enough books and watched enough documentaries, but I'm not a Kingian scholar, but I will say this. If you notice, they used to have a sign that says what? I am a man. I am a man. I'm a man 110%, meaning that I am a human being and that I deserve rights. So categorizing themselves as far as being men and women for that purpose, but being human beings was quite strategic and important. And therefore, since they had to categorize themselves or recategorize, since it was already learned behavior that they were subhuman in certain respects, that recategorizing this document gives them just as much rights as those who wrote this document. Now, what was also interesting about this, I don't see them praising the people that signed the document, but they were looking at the document itself, right? When you look at what's going on, and that's why I said it might have been a prophetic work. I guess the joke is like when we look at Balaam and Balak, right? God can use a donkey, right? So God can use anyone to put out. But that's what I'm saying. God can use anyone, especially for a later purpose, to make sure that rights are secured for all people. And I think that's the emphasis. And I'll tell you this, and you know, I hear a lot about those times. As you know, my parents, which Charles, you know very well, Dr. Sherratt, you don't know my parents very well. But my parents were born in 1946 in Memphis, Tennessee. So they had to go to segregated schools, and they were talking to us about that. They had to live a form in the light of Jim Crow law, right, for such a long while before things started to evolve and change. And even up north, when you look in the history books, and you look at Boston itself, right, the desegregation of the buses and the schools and that type of thing, that was much later, right, the 70s, pretty much the 80s, if you want to just round it off, but it was quite significant. As far as making sure people understand that, again, all people, right? Whether you black, brown, green, or yellow, we are all human beings and we all deserve rights, especially to this document. So if I were to take something back, Charles, if you don't mind me doing it, if there was a genius, it was God's hand using these men, whether they were good or bad, in penning this document that can be later used as a reference point to make a better society.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think Michael is quite right to say is this, you can characterize it as prophetic, because I mean, the best way to argue with someone is to point out that they've already taken your side. And the Declaration declares that all people are created equal. And it's, you know, it's, well, for another conversation, you know, your reference to Jim Crow, of course, and how that was put in place after the end of slavery to kind of preserve the advantages of the white population, all those sorts of things, this dreadful history that we, you know, that still hangs over us and has a huge effect on the country, as we saw this summer, right? But the language of the Declaration of Independence makes the argument for universal human rights. And because it makes that argument, those who oppose it are opposing a foundational document that shapes the United States.
You know, it's interesting, you both made us a couple of really good points that I want to draw out there. Is I never really did think about the fact that the document itself is a persuading document. Right, we are declaring independence because of A, B, C, 27 reasons of what the British have done to us. No offense, Tim, but what they've done to us, and therefore, our response to it is reasonable.
Right.
It doesn't seek to persuade when it says all men are created equal. It merely asserts. Right, and so there's some things, and it doesn't try to persuade when it says all that we're endowed by our Creator. It asserts. And so it takes those things and it moves them past discussion because we all know them, right?
Right.
Nobody has to talk about that. These things we have to talk about. I never really realized that. And Michael, I thought your point about I don't think I ever knew that this was a connection. Is clearly the Declaration says all men are created equal. I never heard I am a man to be trying to force that connection of therefore I'm equal. I just always heard as I'm a man, so treat me with respect, I'm a human being. But it's actually, you're making the point, it's actually connected to this because once you recognize I'm a man, you have to treat me equally.
Right.
Did I hear you right?
Right. And it's also, you look at various communities. So like when I learned about my parents' history, for instance, certain folks lived in certain communities. And you were a man in your community, but when you step out of those boundaries, you were not a man.
Yeah.
It affects your universal rights. And so that right there is problematic within itself. And again, this document and that particular fight, and it's a continual fight for that matter, but it's reminding people that all people are created equal. We all have universal rights. We have rights and liberties given to us by God, and we're to celebrate that. And, you know, it's too bad. It's too bad not many people look at that. And again, people are running by, and I don't blame them, they're running by their ancestors, right? Learned behavior. And it's amazing how learned behavior can play a part, man, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later. And you don't realize that that behavior was, you know, it came from someone before you. You think it's brand new under the sun, but, you know, it's just like what the Bible says. There's nothing new under the sun. And this is why documents like these have to be critically examined and looked at. Well, how does this apply? As we said earlier, that this document is totally relevant to now, but we have to look at its relevancy and be able to dissect where it needs to be even more of a priority. Like, what areas do we need to examine as far as to make sure that this document, for the purposes of God's hand, right? Not necessarily Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and all those. No, they just probably needed to be used as far as to get the document out. However, God had this penned for a specific purpose, for a specific time, and for us as a people, so that we can live in harmony with one another and not against one another.
Yeah, I've been using the example. I remember I shared it with you, Michael. I don't know, Tim, if we taught, when we first met, I shared it with you, is that my wife and I taught our children how to handle money. And we taught them the way we were taught. And we were taught by children of the Depression. Mm-hmm. So my children are 3 or 4 generations removed from the Depression, but they handle money like that, like the Depression was real to them. And so I have that sense that our history is always impacting us. Right. And I found a quote by James Baldwin, who said, "The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we are frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations." I thought that was such a crisp, concise way to talk about why things like we talked about Uncle Tom's Cabin not too long ago on one of our podcasts, the Declaration. We're going to talk about Reconstruction, Jim Crow, all because that history is still in us, even when we don't know the history.
Yeah, but can I say something that's also fascinating, Charles?
Yeah.
History repeats itself. And I think that was also the highlight of James Baldwin, reminding us that history repeats itself. The guy was brilliant. And it makes a whole world of sense. Like, even when you look at what's going on now with this pandemic, it really, to me, it really mirrors the Depression in so many ways.
Yeah.
You think about it, there's certain elements of when you learn about the Depression that apply to now. We've been doing with our particular ministry food distribution. And if you see it, and if you watch the movies again, I watched documentaries. I wasn't alive back then, but it gave me a reference point like, wow, people are really hurting. People are really challenged. And now we have to utilize documents such as the Declaration of Independence to remind each other to take care of one another. We have to remind each other that we are, again, under God. We're governed by God, and we're created equal. And how can we use these documents to unify one another so that if there is a need, how can we provide for that need? And obviously for believers, right, now it's also a means of evangelism, right? We can use this as an evangelistic tool to now share the gospel with someone.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so I like the way Martin Luther King referred to it, as he talked about it as the great promissory note, right? As I have a dream speech. Right. So, Michael, he was making the point, I think, that you were making too, of we wrote a check at the founding, that all men are created equal. Whether we all meant the same thing by that or not, maybe a question. But we wrote that check, and all he was saying is honor. You know, I think the genius of what he did, a part of it at least, was just honor what you say you believe.
Right.
That I'm not asking for more than you to do what you say you believe, and that was, I think, compelling for many people, and of course threatening for many. Right. And so, would you guys like to comment on any other leaders and how they thought about the Declaration of Independence? So whether it's Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, any thoughts from any of those guys about how they thought about it?
Well, I mean, Lincoln comes to mind as someone who sort of reached back before the Constitution to the Declaration and to the idea that the Union itself was sacred. And I think all of his, his defense of the Union position in the Civil War, all of it goes back to the Declaration and what he argues happened there. Of course, we think of the Gettysburg Address, which is really a sort of summary reflection on the Declaration of Independence and its this distinctive and important revolutionary new way of thinking about people and government, people and authority, and of course the famous notion of government, of, by, and for the people. That is what's set in motion by the Declaration, and I think for Lincoln, that that idea supersedes really all the struggles, and it has to be retained. So even a civil war, ghastly though it is, can be fought in the name of that.
But I also think, Dr. Sherratt, respectfully, Lincoln had his challenges.
Oh, yeah.
If you read about Lincoln, Lincoln really wrestled with how he viewed Black people.
Oh, yeah.
For instance, he wrestled with how to deal with them because of learned behavior. He was taught a certain way.
That's
and
right.
Now, as a leader, you have to wrestle with whether this is true or not. And Lincoln, I like Lincoln, but I struggle with Lincoln. I'm a little challenged by President Lincoln.
I like Lincoln too, right?
Yeah, I mean, but it's just like in our community, we were taught, especially reading about him, for instance, in order to sway other people who were against slavery, it had to be more of a business deal.
Oh, he's a politician, right?
Yeah. How can I hurt your pocket? And so, whether or not that's something to also think about, right? And that's something to take into consideration. But Lincoln also shows, if we use the example of Lincoln, he also shows wrestling with the human psyche, right? And really trying to navigate or draw closer to God in the meantime, really understanding that, God's thoughts are not our thoughts. His ways are not our ways. And really, it's something I think that is really beautiful. Some people would say it's beautifully strange in certain respects. I know it's an oxymoron, but there's something very beautiful about that part, about how we have to work out our salvation and how we have to wrestle with elements such as that, which later on became such a big tussle. Again, if we were to go back to civil rights, which Charles keeps pointing us back to, right? The civil rights movement, that wrestling, right? To show again that you wrote a check and now it needs to be paid in full, it needs to be cashed. And you may not realize the check you were writing, but now we realize it, and it has to be cashed, and it has to happen. So
yeah, I think as I've read about Lincoln over the years, it's a little bit of the same thing with the John Adams conversation. Right. The stuff Lincoln believes that he's writing in personal letters and his journals that he's not willing to say publicly because he knows he's going to lose people.
Right.
He does that and needs them on board. And so we'll talk sometimes more about preserving the Union, at least early on, than about freeing the slaves, which in his private writings, he seems to talk about very clearly that that's the end goal here. We've got to end slavery. but not recognizing that not everybody in the North is willing to fight and die to end slavery, but they are to preserve the Union.
Yep.
But I also think, too, he played the game. That's what we would call it. He played the game. He played chess instead of checkers. Mm-hmm. And that's what's so significant about that moment. And I even think now, you know, you're looking at what's going on, you have to play chess instead of checkers. You have to utilize probably platforms in a certain way to deal with certain, again, I know I keep hitting it hard, learned behaviors, because that's how people have been taught. And in order for you to really change your mindset, you have to understand first where they learned what they learned and the patternization of what they learned. So that way you can deprogram and reprogram and really help them get where they need to go. And I think Lincoln was very, very instrumental in with his other colleagues. And I will say this, he was instrumental probably to where we are with civil rights now. Now, we may not give him the credit, you know, probably reading the other pieces of it that he wrestled with, and I know people who would give him a hard time. However, he was instrumental. He was instrumental as far as, and when you brought up, and I don't mean to take us a little bit out, but I am, Charles, so forgive me, but when you brought up Dr. King, it was amazing to me about Dr. King how he used the lessons and theories from Mahatma Gandhi, right? Gandhi, they would argue, would say was racist himself in certain respects, but that's something he was taught and he had to transition and all sorts of different things. And I don't want to take away from the conversation, but
protest and right, yeah. The John Meacham tells a great story in his book on Reconstruction. We'll get to Reconstruction eventually, but where he talks about LBJ being in the same position on the Civil Rights Bill. George Wallace is standing in this school classroom doorway, and he's saying, "I can send the army down there, but I'll lose every moderate, and the whole thing is over." Right. And so then he did typical LBJ stuff about how he worked on George Wallace, which is kind of interesting. But his book on Reconstruction really does talk about that. And we'll get to that in a future episode. So anything before we go, any last comments or thoughts that you really think are important that we didn't touch on?
Yeah, well, not so much something we didn't touch on, because I think we did cover it. I don't think that we should look at the Declaration of Independence as all one thing or all the other, sort of, you know, a perfect document or utterly flawed, because I think that's that doesn't do justice to the fact, we've mentioned it a number of times, that human beings have fallen. I mean, we know this. I mean, we ought to call it unoriginal sins, because most of them are. And, you know, I think it's very important that we don't have a sort of airbrushed kind of history. We need a warts and all history, because I think what we've tried to bring out, I sense in this conversation, is that for all the flaws in those who wrote the Declaration of Independence, and we could sure talk some more about them, the Declaration of Independence has set in motion some very important elements of our form of government, and in the whole area of civil rights. It's really important as something to be, I don't know what's the right word, to be mined for this principle of basic human equality. I mean, the Declaration doesn't do a lot of things. It doesn't teach us how to care for one another, anything like that. But this basic establishing of the principle of universal equality is surely its great achievement. So let's have a warts and all reading of the thing. I think that's what we need.
That's a great point, right? There's so much temptation in today's polarized world that everything is one or the other. Yep. There's no gray or anything like that. And if we Christians should be okay with that, because we should be able to see God's blessed us with so many things. Yeah. In the Declaration, I love that first term of what it set in motion. That saved the world from Nazi Germany and totalitarian Japan, and so there's this huge value that has just flowed from it, and the prosperity that's kept so many from starving, and yet that doesn't make it a perfect document, right? And there's flaws. I think that's a great point. Michael, any closing thoughts?
I would say this. I echo what Dr. Sherratt has already said. I don't need to repeat what he has said, but I will add again, it's a prophetic work. It's a prophetic work. And since it's a prophetic work, now it's I guess, coming to fruition. And again, it's not being dismissive about it. I mean, we have to look at the different times, how it was written back then, and where does it apply now. And I think we're all in agreement that this document is relevant and it can make a difference. And we have to obviously look at the challenging pieces of it, but celebrate also the pieces that we can work on now by becoming better people and better citizens. Charles.
Great words to close on, Michael. Thank you. And for our listeners, I would say thank you for listening. But also, I would say, if you haven't read it in a long time, read the Declaration of Independence and read it to your children and read it to your grandchildren. I used to make our kids read it with me every July 4th. They're older now, so they won't read it with me and they won't listen to me when I tell them to read it themselves. But it's not a lot. It's not like it's 27 pages. It's a pretty crisp, concise document, and you get some of the real sense in it. And it's those things that are unifying to us, right? Because we can all say, well, we're Americans, right? Or we're in America, and those things are relevant to us. So, but thank you to the audience, but thank you to you, Michael. Thank you, Tim. Appreciate you so much for sharing your perspectives and your time, because I have a pretty good idea how busy you both are. So I'm really grateful to you for this and for engaging this conversation with them. I hope it's been helpful to folks to understand some of the different challenges on it and how different people may see it. And that can be something that God just causes us to maybe chew on a little bit. Remember Mary, I forget the phrase of what Mary pondered these things in her heart, right? That this would be something we ponder in our hearts, that then it could be something that God starts to use to help us find some unity in the church because we understand each other better, and that we might be able to be a witness to the world for evangelistic reasons, and because we're called to be peacemakers. I'd also like to thank our producer, Bob Atherton. Our next podcast is October 29th at 10 a.m. and we'll be talking to Dr. Brian Mowry from Walnut Hill Community Church in Connecticut about his book, On the Other Side of Yes, which is really, I just found as a real good practical guide for uncovering God's plan in your life, correcting course if that's necessary, and living the fullness of life Jesus intends for us. So join us for that, and thank you, Michael and Tim, again, and God bless you, and see you next time.
Thank you for joining the podcast today. If you'd like to learn more about Vision New England and what God is doing in our region, check out our website at visionnewengland.org. We hope you'll join us next time for the Church in Action podcast.